Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, host and executive producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Randy Baier. Today we'll talk about books that we received for review. Welcome to Rip Rap.
I'm glad to be here yet again. I'm looking forward to the surprises of the day.
Well, the first book...
We've gone a month, I think, since we last talked.
The first book I thought was kind of interesting, The Invisible Gorilla, How Our Intuitions Deceive Us, by Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons. And I just thought this is a really kind of fun thing, because he talks about, for example, why would a company spend billions on a product it knows will fail?
That's interesting. I'd like to know the answer to that.
Another one's, what do criminals have in common with chess masters?
Interesting.
And what he's talking about is this whole thing with intuition, that people are playing in a deeper level. Mm-hmm. With the criminals and chess masters, it's just because they both need skills to deceive their opponent. But they have to have strategies on how they're going to do that.
Well, I imagine the successful criminals would have to be able to see a lot of different possibilities at once and know that what the outcomes of certain actions would be and what those would perpetrate down the line.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I can see how that would be something, because sometimes I wonder, you wonder, why would you do this? Somebody recently stole an illustration at the building where I work, and the door was numbered. There's a code, and there's a camera in front of the door. So the question is, what intuition, what was telling you to go in and get that, it's just interesting that something else is telling you to act.
Well, another thing is they talk about that when you evaluate your opponent, like what you're saying, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. and that you try to match up with an opponent that you can beat. This is just really fascinating stuff to me. And part of that is what your rating is. You know how well you do.
Yeah, like tennis or golf or something like this. Yeah,
that's a very important part in chess, is because if you're going to play against someone who's higher ranked.
Right, or chess, exactly. Yeah. Because there are rankings in that.
But then the other thing is a certain overconfidence happens because you start thinking you really are good.
Yeah.
And so even though you may know or suspect the other player is better, you just can't stop yourself from trying it out.
Well, does this book sort of contradict the statement that's like, oh, he's so intuitive or she's so intuitive? An intuitive person who has insights.
It's not about that. It's about the gorilla part, which is having to do it even when you know better.
Okay.
You're going to do it.
Right.
And that's what plays into effect with the company that spent billions on a product that knows will fail. Well, to a certain extent, it has to. Pfizer, an example, they've designed these. The investment in these drugs now is so enormous.
Yeah.
Some of it's in the billions. That even when they're getting a failure rate, or a higher than normal failure rate, they feel compelled to do it because they've invested.
Right.
See, they're
it's
into
not like,
this
let's
drug.
Cut our losses and move on.
Right. Got to do it.
Going.
And I thought.
Well, people in lawsuits are the same way, I would imagine. They feel they have a good argument. They feel they can win the case, and yet the sort of limitations of the law prevent them from doing that. And yet they spend a lot of money with lawyers.
Well, and it talks about also people who get a certain diagnostic and prognosis from a doctor, mm-hmm. and rationally they should do something. A certain treatment program. But then there's the irrational part of it.
Yeah.
And people just not do it. Or one of the biggest problems I've read in research is that even after medication's prescribed, mm-hmm. people don't take it. Mm-hmm. Or they don't take it at the rate that will really do them well.
According to the schedule, right.
Because they don't like it, doesn't taste good, it has effect. Another thing to talk about is everyone thinks that they're underrated. You put that with overconfidence, and now you've got a brew that's just going to be really quite interesting. So I found this book really, serious research, but this whole thing of misunderstanding. They talk. One chapter is about the coach who choked, Bobby Knight. He was a 4-time National Coach of the Year, led the 1984 Olympic gold medal team, famous for running a clean basketball operation, and that his dismissal was triggered by a lecture on respect. Because throughout his coaching career, he had a national reputation for volatile temper, crass behavior. I mean, it was real awful.
Very crass. I mean, he threw chairs and
berated referees and journalists and the whole thing.
But I think the final edge was when he attacked his players. He berated his players. He went beyond the pale on that.
An incident described by Neil Reed, one of Knight's former players. Knight confronted him for failing to call out a teammate's name while making a pass, but Reed stood his ground, claiming he had in fact yelled the name, and then Knight physically attacked him. Could not stop himself. He was starting to believe his own mythology.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, this is really, and he came at him, at the player, and held him by the throat for like 5 seconds. And he grabbed his wrist and started walking back. And then other coaches and that, started grabbing him, pulling him away. Yeah. But see, he was so caught up into what he was doing that he couldn't stop. And to a certain extent, like you're saying, there's the myth of intuition, that you rely on your gut feeling that people talk about. But what they're trying to point out is that may not be a trustworthy
right. That's what I was wondering about. It's true.
It says, apply what you've learned about everyday illusions to this the profile of business leader Larry Taylor. He was on his way to work. He's, ramrod straight kind of guy. And then you follow him around. His company's revenues are growing at a rate of 45%. He's voted the most innovative and effective executive in the Midwest. And he just can't stop himself from going the next step. And he relied on his instincts when he decided to bet his company's future on the new logistics software for mom and pop internet businesses.
The whole kit and caboodle. I take it failed.
Yeah, didn't work out so well.
Well, of course, that might. I mean, a lot of successful investment or risk takers in whatever field. Many of them practice the principle that failure is a way to get better at what you do. Everything doesn't become successful, and so if something fails, it goes way back to first grade, second grade math. You do it till you understand the principle and get it right, but you make a lot of mistakes along the way. I wonder if there's some way that intuition can be channeled.
Well, it can be,
so
but
you
still have to weigh it, because remember, you can get into an overconfident state.
Yeah, that's what this is concentrating on. Is sort of
the misjudgment.
Right.
And that
you get on a roll.
But if you've managed to pull stuff off and you pull it out, rabbit out of the box, so to speak, out of the hat.
Right.
You do that one too many times, and now it's your terms of risk. You're exceeding the probability that it's going to continue to work.
The risk.
But that's not the way human beings are. If they pulled it off, they'll keep expecting they can pull it off again.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work.
And you're
still pushing. And they're saying that this thing of common sense has another name, intuition. What we intuitively accept and believe is derived from what we collectively assume and understand.
Well, this gets to the point of, I wonder how much intuition is actually cultural, nurtured, and understanding the context of a situation, as opposed to a natural state or an unbiased state. I'm just thinking in terms of the psychology of it, or the interpersonal aspect of what intuition really is. I mean, in order to be insightful, you have to understand the context of the the information you're receiving.
Well,
And be able to predict, I imagine, what might happen.
as an example, they talk about a test they did involving tasting strawberry jam. And when they were asked to rate the quality, they spent a couple of minutes writing down the reasons for liking and disliking each kind of jam, and then rated them on a scale from 1 to 9. Well, the experts had one rating, and students had another.
And the reason?
Because once they engaged the students with, critical thinking,
Yeah.
then their ratings were similar to the experts. But the students, when they were just willy-nilly kind of just
Right.
ranking them,
Right.
using gut feelings, it was way off.
Right.
So I thought that was, and that's what can happen. I mean, you think that you have a rational process for evaluating something, and it just isn't there. Another thing that you enjoy is technology to the rescue. That it's easier to point out that the nature of everyday illusions and their potentially dire consequences. It's easier to point out the nature of everyday illusions and their potential consequences than it is to find solutions to the problems they pose. And first, simply learning how everyday illusions work, for example, by reading this book, will help you notice and avoid being victimized by them in the future. Because again, you're using critical thinking. You're starting to think about it, not just react. Second, you could try to enhance your cognitive abilities through training. In other words, you've learned a certain pattern.
This is being able to read the messages of your intuition and
and take them aboard and having a collective building of wisdom instead of just relying on arbitrary, kinds of things.
Yes, exactly.
And I thought it was interesting to say technology holds promise as a helpful tool to avoid everyday illusions. Well, that's a chunk. Indeed, there are already many mundane examples of technologies that have helped us overcome mental limitations. Writing, for example, helped humans preserve historical information more precisely and in larger quantity than would have been possible through memory and oral tradition.
Right. Although the oral tradition can remember an awful lot.
Yeah.
But it has to be
in a different
constantly
way.
practiced. Yes.
A different way.
Yeah.
It's more qualitative than quantitative.
Yeah.
So I thought it says, look for the invisible gorillas. What is this huge emotional factor?
Right. Why am I being pulled in this direction?
And what I thought was really funny, is they talk about Woody Allen said when he reached the end of his legendary stand-up comedy routine, I wish I had some kind of affirmative message to leave you with. I don't. Would you take 2 negative messages? And they said, one of our messages in this book is indeed negative. Be wary of your intuitions, especially intuitions about how your own mind works.
Yeah.
Our mental systems for rapid cognition excel at solving the problems they evolved to solve. And this is where you were saying, but our cultures, societies, and technologies today are much more complex than those of our ancestors. In many cases, intuition is poorly adapted to solving problems in the modern world.
That's interesting.
Because the processes are not intuitive.
Right.
They're technical.
Yeah, you have to understand
So you have to know what to do.
How something is working.
You can put your hand on a computer, but it's not going to turn on.
Right.
And even if you get it turned on, you're not going to be able to do anything with it unless you know how to open a document or set up the software. And then they said, but we have an affirmative message to leave you with. You can make better decisions and maybe even live a better life if you do your best to look for the invisible gorillas in the world around you. And I think that's very solid. We were just trying to be clever when we titled our original article on the gorilla experiment, Gorillas in Our Midst. But in a metaphorical sense, there are gorillas in our midst. There may be important things right in front of you that you aren't noticing due to the illusion of attention.
Yeah.
Now that you know about this illusion, you'll be less apt to assume you're seeing everything that there is to see. You may think you remember some things much better than you really do because of the illusion of memory.
Well, the argument about assumptions is pretty important because we we work on so many assumptions, and when you get into an interpersonal difference of opinion, or parenting situation, or interpersonal conflict, or even some political situation, or especially just the stuff that you go talk to a counselor about, all those things are based on assumptions about what an outcome might be, how the other person thinks, and the intuition does not have a standard
I think
sort of
one distinct
pattern.
difference of what it is to exist now versus our ancestors is the flow of information at all the levels is so much more.
Now, absolutely.
Yeah. And so
it has no, in a sense, a hierarchy to it. There, you have to discover the authority, the value, the authority, the correctness, or however you want to put it, of information, and understand how it's structured, its sort of ethos, worldview.
Well, I think what people try to do is set up certain kinds of filters so that it'll screen out the extraneous.
Right.
That's a constant problem.
Right.
The clutter, the spam, all that stuff to get to the nuggets of information that you need to have to function.
Right.
What I like about the book is it's adding a little more to that, which is not only just the immediate stuff, but take into account the irrational factors that you need to be aware of. So it's making the whole idea of cognition and perception much more complex, but I think valuable. Certainly we should challenge when we have a response, based on this irrational the impulse.
Right.
Then we ought to kind of interrogate that and say, well, what is this? Like they point out in the book, you might be able to get away with it once, maybe twice. But as an ongoing...
Ocean's 12 only comes along once in your life. And
as an ongoing pattern of behavior, you're really pushing probabilities in the wrong way.
Well, the interesting thing about this, and to take the technological argument, if you look at, there's recently been a sort of a buzz on the internet because of a couple of presentations from these TED seminars. I forget the fellow's name, but he gave a presentation about how Google and other search engines, they watch very carefully what you search for.
Oh, yeah.
And this is a common thing. We all know this, but the depth of what they do can be pretty insidious. So you're thinking that you're putting in terminology and this and that, but if you, as you search for things in any particular search session, what you pick, or what you actually use as search terms, brings up a set, and that now the computer will start to read what you've been doing and give you, lists of things. And you can prove it to yourself by taking a completely different computer that you have not been on, do the same search, and the results will be completely different. And it's almost creating, but you don't feel that. You don't know. You have to really know that that's so that you can play it. And there's a way to cut off these habits of the particular computer you work on. But the more you work on a particular computer, that site that you work from, the world, the cloud is knowing what you're doing. And
You've been tagged.
You've been tagged. And you think, you think you've got this intuition about, okay, what words will I use and this and that. But actually, you could put the same words, same searches, reconstruct sentences, and do an information search, and you'll never...
What I find not a little unnerving is when you're dealing with a certain website and then they start telling you, well, based on your previous purchases, then this is what you'd be interested in.
This is what Amazon does.
I don't want you keeping track of
these other people that bought the book you're about to buy have also bought these.
That's one level.
books.
If they suggesting, but when they say, based on your purchases, these are other books that you'd be interested in.
Well, that's a really interesting. I guess this has nothing to do with intuition, except in the sense that it's a game to try to figure out what you'll like. I mean, that's sort of trying to predict.
That's
an
a powerful.
intuition.
That's a potent factor.
But music sites, a lot of automatic knowledge, is that the way to put it? The web prediction module algorithms a website like Pandora or others, you'll put in this thing and call it, okay, I'll put in a Neil Young, let's make a Neil Young album, and you ask for 2 or 3 songs, and then it says, do you want to create a Neil Young zone? And then it starts to predict. It grabs music from those common characteristics and starts to feed it to you. Based on this, we think you'd like this.
So this is in line with some research I've been doing on cognitive task, or cognitive recognition, or task recognition, and that was started to look at artificial intelligence. How did people process, understand a task, and performing it? I found this really fascinating in terms of writing, because students will have to first process what the task is in order to understand how they do it. So I've been doing it, but that's what this sounds like. Is that, how is someone perceiving the task, and then do they have a deliberate method for accomplishing it?
Right.
And the ones that do the worst, or not as well, are the ones that don't have that ability to process it properly. They do go by any number of irrational factors.
That's
just
really
guessing
true.
to all kinds of weird things. Past history, I've always done it this way, so I ought to try doing it this way. So they said our final hope is that you'll always consider this possibility that everyday illusions affect us all before you jump to a harsher conclusion. And I think that's really helpful. Well, one of the books we have here is kind of a fond one. It's David McCullough's.
David McCullough, The Greater Journey, Americans in Paris. And a lovely illustration on the front cover who I'm trying to grab and figure out what the frontispiece is. Photographs of end of the previous century, Paris, and this is
sort of the 1920s era. But he did some substantive research into what was going on. The land of Gertrude Stein and Hemingway and Fitzgerald, and I'm still myself trying to figure out, why did all these people go to Paris? What was it they were looking for? And I think they were looking for a more tolerant culture. At the time, the American culture was pretty intolerant. It didn't like people that were really speaking up and exploring things.
Well, Paris is well known in the early parts of the 20th century as a place where African American performers, jazz dancers, were extremely successful. Stars. Back home on our turf,
African Americans in Paris were revered. They had an extra cachet.
Josephine Baker and all. There may be some other element there, but in terms of the fascination with people of African background, because I know the French, I think, have that aspect from their colonial history as well. But just the same, the performance in general in Europe, African American performers of color have always been, I think, more successful there than...
Well, they were accepted. In fact, they go to Paris to develop their style, their reputation, and then come back to the United States to make the money.
I know that many jazz performers, of the 40s, 50s, was a kind of exodus to Paris, to Copenhagen, to Berlin, Amsterdam. This is reading like a. Would you say this is a highly documented intellectual kind of history, or is it a?
Well, it's also a story.
Masterpieces of.
McCullough can tell a good story.
Right.
And there's a lot of insights in there that you don't necessarily suspect about the actual. What's interesting now is it's so far away. It's what, 90 years.
This time period.
Yeah, that time period.
We're almost a century
that
away.
it's been mythologized.
Yes.
And so
that's interesting.
What existed isn't what really existed. But but now it's like, that was a time of heaven. And
right. But we're looking at Paris 20s and Americans. We're not looking at the Toulouse-Lautrec, the Impressionist age of the turn of the 20th century. We're looking at after World War I.
In this country, it's been mythologized so that it was a special time.
Right.
Everybody was in wonderful shape. No, they were still, some of them were in desperate shape, trying to survive. They had gone to Paris to find themselves.
Some kind of dream.
Not everyone
and it was
did.
hard.
Not everyone did. And some of them thought that they had it made, and they didn't. Some of them got there, and the same excesses that ultimately did them in just ballooned on them. You know, if you're a drinker like F. Scott Fitzgerald, it just got worse. But the artistic impulse was able to develop, and I think that was precious. But still, we lose track of the individual people with the mythology. You know, we want to believe what we want to believe. Sort of the inner gorilla thing, I think.
Yeah, I guess so.
You know?
I guess so.
A lot of people forget that, you know, to a certain extent, Gertrude Stein was nuts. You know, she was brilliant, but she was nuts. Ezra Pound was nuts. I mean, you know, he got even hospitalized because he just had trouble keeping the car on the road.
Later years of his life were,
But still, it was a wonderful time in terms of having that going on.
I see that in here they're following Sargent, John Singer Sargent, and he has a real Paris period. In fact, there's a painting in here, The Daughters, a very famous painting, which is in Boston. But they were 3 or 4 years. And this was an era when the wealthy could move by ship a whole house and apartment, and they rented, you know, the floor of an enormous building in the center of Paris for his studio and his family. And it's really interesting to see, they're following it here, the painting, Madame X, this well-known painting of his, a photograph of him painting the painting, and then the daughters of, the 4 daughters. His 4 daughters never, they're an interesting story, that the 4 of them, they never married, they all, you know, lived either together or alone their whole life through, following the estate, you know, of the family.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I was glad to be here.